say welcome to everybody to today's call, a conversation about Afghanistan. It's going to be a wonderful panel, wonderful discussion about a topic that's very serious, though. So thank you for participating. Thank you for joining us. My name is Greg Sharano. For those who don't know me, I'm a co-founder of Refugee Action Fund. We started Refugee Action Fund 5 years ago. It's hard to imagine it's been 5 years already. And it was done in response at that time to the rising xenophobia around the world that was straining in its ability to respond to the needs of the Syrian refugee population. What we've learned and what we've experienced over the last 5 years is that the work we do is not in response to any one event at any one time, that the need of refugees, the need of migrants around the world is a continuing, ongoing effort. And I'm very proud to be part of a group, part of a community, part of friendships that come together to support people who are forced to flee their home. It is that simple. They don't have a choice. And their needs, we try to meet. So over the last 5 years, we've raised and granted out over $1.5 million to support these people who have no choice. And I like to emphasize that because it's something that gets missed a lot in the conversations, that they are choosing to make these moves. They're responding to events, whether it be climate, war, civil disorder, and we can come together as a community to do something about it. And that's something that brings me pride and brings me joy. And when we get to host these panels and discussions, we get to bring everyone together to understand the needs of other people. So through grant making, which we focus on the needs throughout the life cycle of refugee, from advocacy, legal defense, legal support, resettlement, we try to meet the needs however best we can through finding great grantees, great partners who are doing critical services to support this population that needs our help. So with that, I'd like to introduce Julie Gersten, the Executive Director of Refugee Action Fund. And she's going to introduce the panelists and give you a little bit of a background on what else we're going to discuss today. So thank you again. I really appreciate your support and your time.
Thank you, Greg. I'm actually not going to introduce the panelists because they're amazing. They're really incredible people, and I want them to have the opportunity to share their stories and tell you about them themselves. But before we get started, I just want to mention a quick housekeeping note, which is just, if you can please keep yourself on mute. And if you have any questions, we've got a lot of content to go through. So if you have questions, we'd love to try to answer them. Please just put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end. And I'm really, really delighted to introduce you to our speakers tonight, Sahar Muhammad Ali, Timur Nusrati, and Michael Sheikh. And as I mentioned, I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So it's Timur, I would love it if you could just sort of share a little bit about who you are and your connection to Afghanistan, and then we'll go to Sahar and to Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Julie. Can you hear me, by the way? Oh, wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Timur Nusrati. Very pleased to be part of this esteemed panel. Thank you, Julie, for including me, Greg. I am an Afghan American who was born in Berkeley, California, where I'm actually sitting right now. I can actually look and see Berkeley Hills. My father was from Afghanistan and my mother's American. They actually met as students at Berkeley in the early 60s. My father had immigrated from Kabul to the United States, to California, to Berkeley, to attend the university here in the late 50s. And he met my mother, who was a young American student. At a time when I guess it was not so orthodox for a Muslim man from Afghanistan to meet and marry a girl from the Midwest, a Catholic school girl. But they made it work, and they eventually went on to open the first Afghan restaurant in the United States in 1968, the Khyber Pass restaurant, which was opened in Oakland, California, not too far from here. And it was a place where I was born into in the mid 70s, and it became kind of a beacon of light for a lot of Afghans who came at the beginning of the Soviet War. And my father did a lot of work with a lot of the other Afghans who were living in the Bay Area at the time to sponsor and to welcome the waves of Afghans who arrived in the 80s, throughout the 80s. As refugees, I have early memories of going to San Francisco International Airport very frequently to welcome these waves of refugees, many of whom would end up either staying at the restaurant because there was an apartment building and working there. And also my father provided sponsorships to many and a lot of his friends who were prominent Afghan business people in the Bay Area at the time, who had studied at either Berkeley or Stanford or on the West Coast. So that wave of early Afghans had come as part of the brain drain generation in the 50s and 60s, and who stayed on in the United States and were basically anchors for a lot of these Afghans who came. I ended up living in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2010. I was living in New York City studying law when 9/11 happened, and I decided to take the decision to move to Afghanistan first in 2003, and then I moving there from 2005 to 2010, where I worked first as a legal advisor to the Ministry of Information and Communications Technology. I served on the group that drafted the telecommunications law, which created the telecom framework of Afghanistan and gave rise to the nascent telecom sector, the mobile network operators, and a lot of the other technical providers that were operating successfully from about 2005 to well, they're still operating now, but it was one of the most, if not the most successful sector in the country during that period. And I ended up working for Roshan, which is the largest mobile operator in Afghanistan, which is like the Verizon of Afghanistan. I lived there. I ran their legal department for about just shy of 6 years to 2010. And most recently, I've been working as general counsel for a company called Geopol. We facilitate research and data collection and analysis in emerging markets, biggest footprints in Africa, but we're also in Afghanistan now. So it's all about data collection, data analysis, and surveys and polls in emerging markets, which we use to service large development organizations, donors, and the like the UN agencies. And right now, at this point in Afghanistan, we're risking going into data darkness, which had occurred previous era in the 90s. We're risking that now. So the work we're doing is hopefully going to shed light and continue to provide data in an area where potentially that's at risk. I could continue, Julie, to go on, or did you want me to continue? I don't want to take too much time from my fellow panelists, and I'm happy to continue if you wish.
Timur, will you just mention the Flower Cafe? Because I want
I'm
people
sorry.
to know that too.
Sorry,
No, it's such a great story.
A very important point. I was the owner and managing partner of Flower Street Cafe, which is a coffee shop, bistro restaurant in Kabul. Had 3 locations from 2004 to 2012. So that was my labor of love. Whilst I was running the legal department of the largest telco, I was also running a restaurant chain in Kabul, which no longer is open, unfortunately closed in 2012, but still have fond memories. And a lot of people potentially who lived in Afghanistan, Kabul during that period would have been our patrons. Sorry, I missed that point out there, Julie. I'm happy to talk about more about that, of course.
Great, thank you so much, Timur. Sahar, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks so much, Julie, and it's great to follow Timur. And yes, the Flower Street Cafe, I've spent many really good coffees there and lunch, and it was really a place where a lot of us used to hang out. My involvement in Afghanistan also began around September 11, living in New York City, and then going to the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was working with the International Rescue Committee, and we were in the tribal areas on the border processing Afghans fleeing US airstrikes and US bombing. And after that, I graduated law school, so I was working at a law firm and looking at the detention, torture, the overreaction of the United States government and military in response to 9/11. So I was working on that file and those issues, spending a lot of time in Guantanamo, as well, advocating on behalf of detainees. And then I started working with Human Rights Watch, where I met Mike Sheikh, who's going to talk about his work in Afghanistan. But I worked in another organization on detention issues in Bagram. It was a big detention facility that was maintained by the US, and some of the indefinite detention concerned arbitrary detention, ill treatment that took place in some of those prisons, as well as civilian casualties caused by US airstrikes. And in my current job, I am the director of our Middle East and South Asia program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And we have done a lot of work in Afghanistan, trying to get the US and NATO forces to acknowledge civilian harm that occurs during the military operations and to change their military tactics so they can mitigate civilian harm. As part of that, I also did a lot of work with Afghan security forces and the Afghan government on their protection of civilians policies, trainings, etc. So it is very, given what has happened in the last month, it's just really interesting to see some of the work just disappear. Or getting messages from officials or people who really invested in the country and NGO and civil society. And we worked a lot with Afghans in the communities in the rural areas who were advocating on their concerns regarding the physical safety with Taliban commanders, etc., with the Afghan forces. And so suddenly seeing all of that disappear and sort of at a pause as we reassess and adapt our strategy it's been interesting. So again, my work, of course, my connection to Afghanistan is more from the policy, technical work, but still, I've spent over 2 decades making such phenomenal friends in Afghanistan, and I really hold it very personal and dear to my heart. So the work has to sort of continue in Afghanistan. So I'll just sort of stop there.
Thank you, Sahar. And I know you've been working around the clock getting people out, so I'll have you talk about that next. So thank you for sharing. Michael?
Hi, well, thank you everyone. And thank you, Julie and Greg. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Refugee Action Fund, and it's my second panel or event with RAF, and it's really just an incredible organization and a really timely one too. It's really an organization, I think, that's really trying to get down to those small groups that we don't often think about that are really doing most of the heavy lifting to help refugees in times like this. In terms of my background, I was the country director for International Crisis Group for a few years, and that's where I met Timur and Sahar and worked with them tangentially for a little while. My job there was to basically provide on-the-ground political analysis about the drivers of conflict in Afghanistan. And at that time, I was looking at warlords and their roles in the elections. After International Crisis Group, I jumped over to Human Rights Watch, where I started leading their work, getting more directly involved in investigating human rights abuses, particularly war crimes by the warring parties, namely NATO, allegations of war crimes, I should say, by NATO, the United States, and the Taliban and other militant groups, as well as the Afghan government itself. After that, I continued working on Afghanistan. I taking a step back, but I started working for the Center for Civilians for Conflict, Civic, where Sahar works now. I was the director of the country operations, looking across all of the organization's programs across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia at that point. And we were just starting working with the Afghan National Security Forces to build a civilian casualty tracking cell that Sahar has been working pretty diligently on since that time. That I left kind of working full-time on Afghanistan in 2012 until a few months ago. I left that line of work to write a book focusing on how violence that I've witnessed changes culinary traditions. Basically how it disappears, civil wars, genocide, disappear certain dishes or create new ones. And in fact, the genesis of this book was at Timur's dinner table in Kabul. We were eating dinner one night, and and I had been in the country for 4 or 5 years at that, off and on at that point. And I was served a dish that I had never eaten before in Afghanistan. And I'd been around the entire country. It threw me off because everything, a lot of the dishes that I was eating at that time tended to be a similar version of the same thing. And there wasn't a lot of variety at that point. But what taught me was that a lot of that variety was the households. But the dish that I had, I asked this question to Timur and to another gentleman that Timur was living with about, is this Afghan or is it an Iranian dish or is it like, where does it come from? Like, no, this is Afghan. And they told me the story of this dish, and what it led me by asking that question, it led me down a path to see how violence was destroying a lot of Afghanistan's culture. And just imagine when a grandmother dies and takes a recipe to her grave, that was happening in Afghanistan on a countrywide scale. And so that coincidentally, and a lot of that knowledge is retained in diaspora communities and refugee communities. And that's where it goes. And coincidentally, a few weeks ago, I was in California when, in San Diego in particular, when the evacuation was happening, and doing some research with the Afghan diaspora community about how they are trying to protect their own culture outside of the country to keep it alive, and in hopes to take it back when they can go back. And I think, like I said, this is a very timely panel, because right now there is a lot of concern that, instead of people thinking about ever returning home, we're now having people come out and wondering if their children will ever come home, not them. So I think, I'll leave it there, but Sahar and Timur and I have all kind of worked on these issues for quite a long time, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about this and raise some of these issues that have been on our minds for the past few months now.
Thank you so much. I feel honestly so honored to have all three of you with me tonight. I really appreciate your time. Sahar, can you just give us sort of we're living through a crisis that's unfolding and changing every day. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I'm wondering if you can just give us an understanding of where things stand today, what's happening in Afghanistan for those who weren't able to get out, those who are deciding to stay, the hundreds of thousands, or I guess it's about, you can tell us the numbers better, but I have about like 122,000 people who did manage to get out. Where are they? What's going on?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to just give a snapshot based on like those that are trying to leave and what is happening in the country right now. So you're right, over 122,000 were evacuated by August 31st through, with support of the United States government and military. But thousands who want to leave and had been wanting to leave for several years because they had worked for the US military or NATO forces and had special immigrant visas. But the backlog in processing all of that and the challenges, I think, Greg, you talked about in the previous US administration stymieing efforts for people to come to the United States, refugees, and get asylum, also impacted Afghans who had worked with the US military as interpreters, as contractors, or whatever it supported, but they're unable to leave. And thousands of them are still in Afghanistan. And they are trying to leave. They are at risk because there could be reprisal attacks against them. Some people have gone into hiding. It is pretty phenomenal, this sort of, it's called this digital Dunkirk. I don't know, I'm sure you've heard about this term. It's been where people from across the US, veterans, civil society organizations, academic, anybody who's had any relationship with Afghanistan are trying, using all their contacts, to evacuate people. And even now, I think the State Department and Secretary Blinken testified in Congress today, they are now using through diplomatic negotiations with the Taliban to allow people who want to leave out of the country safely. I mean, the Taliban has said that those who have legal papers can leave. And there have been some charter flights that have left since August 31st. I mean, I was able to also evacuate my staff and their dependents through a land crossing. So people are exploring different options. And so those initiatives are ongoing, but it is definitely challenging because which third country to go to. Mm-hmm. Canada has announced an additional 20,000, they can take in 20,000 refugees. Ireland is taking in a few, some other countries are taking in a few. The US has this P2 referral process, but it can take months to process that paperwork. And so a lot of people are in limbo, and for even to come into the US, you have to go to a third country to be vetted, and that could take 13 months to 2 years. So, but again, like, who is going to take these people to a third country to get their applications processed and vetted, etc. So the challenges are enormous. I mean, some countries, I mean, even in Pakistan, some people have been able to get visas to go to Pakistan and wait till they can go to the US or elsewhere. But Albania is taking in those persons who are on their way to the US. But it's a very long, fraught process. And for those that are trying to leave, I mean, Taimur mentioned this about the different waves of people leaving their home country. I mean, most of the people who are leaving are middle class, right? So you have a brain drain in Afghanistan, which is, and you can understand why they want to leave, but it is not good for the country in a long term when the entire educated population is getting up and leaving. But they're also leaving with nothing with them, with just a tiny backpack, a little suitcase. They're saying goodbye to their parents. They're saying goodbye to the extended family. Some people are unable to take their children, unable to, they're leaving behind their siblings. So there's a huge amount of trauma that this entire group of people are experiencing right now. I mean, some of them are still sitting in military bases in Germany and in Doha because they're unable to go to the US because there are, COVID-19 testing, there's measles outbreak, there's where to house them. I mean, the full panoply of things and support that is needed to make somebody whole is the machinery is very slow. Mm-hmm. But again, it's the trauma that all the Afghans who have left and what they've experienced is it's pretty significant. I mean, I feel traumatized too in a way because evacuating people, and you feel like you're responsible for these people, and when the attack happened at the airport, at Hamid Karzai airport, and over 170 Afghan civilians died and children. I mean, it's just pretty traumatic. So the scale of trauma is just huge. And then so there's all of the needs of how do you resettle and make these people whole is so essential. And therefore, I'm so glad that you have had this panel discussion, because the support to Afghans fleeing home, and get them resettled and integrated into new lives is essential. And of course, there's the 35 million Afghans who are not leaving. They have huge needs. I was looking at the statistics today. There was a big donor conference the Secretary General held about a pledging conference to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. And I mean, the UN estimates like 18 million people need humanitarian support. Currently, 500,000 people are internally displaced because of the fighting earlier this month. Primary healthcare is on the brink of collapse. Water services are failing. Food prices are exorbitant. Banks are not functioning. Since Kabul fell, the banks have been closed, so people cannot take money out. In the South, because there was a lot of fighting, so many people are injured. There are so many freshly marked graves in the South because of the fighting in the summer. There's destroyed homes, infrastructure. There's a rise in children getting injured from mines because now mines have been newly planted. I mean, Afghanistan has had 4 decades of war, and you see the cumulative impact on civilians every year, every month, every day from the fighting. So in one sense, it's interesting that there's a pause in sort of fighting across the country, but there are other challenges in terms of humanitarian assistance, but also we don't know what sort of, the reprisal attacks against anybody who worked with foreign forces or the Afghan security forces. The Taliban has said they're gonna have an inclusive government, but, they have basically appointed all men and nobody from the ethnic minority groups in Afghanistan. And they are actually, most of the interim government are on the UN sanctions list or the US terrorist designation list. I think the Minister of Interior has a $5 million FBI award on him. So the challenges are enormous. How do you engage with this entity that is in effective control of an entire country? And how can you negotiate humanitarian assistance, respect for women's rights? They've already put in a lot of restrictions on women, that girls can go to school up to the age 12, but higher education has to be segregated and only be taught by female teachers. and women are not now being restricted in their freedom movement issues for women. I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues, especially impacting women. So the challenges are just enormous, I think, in Afghanistan. And while we are definitely focused on the lens of the evacuation of all those who feel that they need to leave and at risk, it's really important the international community not forget the challenges for the rest of Afghanistan. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I'm just struck by, all of you have spent so much time sort of really invested in a moment in time when Afghanistan was working towards a democratic state that valued human rights. And I would be remiss not to ask you, what are you feeling right now? How did we get here, and what can we learn from this as people who value, human rights and democracy? Michael, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, the simple answer in terms of how I'm quite angry about this. I think it's from a U.S. perspective, it's been an abject failure from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, and I think how we got here was rooted in a few things: ignorance and arrogance. One, on the arrogant side, that the U.S. knew Afghanistan, that it thought it understood Afghanistan, that it thought that it could invade, it could deal with Al-Qaeda, and then rebuild a country at the barrel of a gun. The ignorance is that that's impossible, and not knowing who they were dealing with. And I think there's a few fundamental mistakes here. One is that at the very beginning, there was an opportunity with the Bush administration to bring the Taliban into the peace negotiation. They were the losers, fair enough. They were a terrible government. But in terms of reconciliation and unifying the country, that was a very poor political miscalculation not to bring the losers of a war into the peace process in order to build some unity towards a common vision. By not doing that, what the US effectively did, and the West by extension, was intervene in the civil war. As Sahar mentioned, this was a 40, 50-year civil war. This was not a new war that started in 2001. It had been going on for 2 decades. And the US intervened in the civil war and took a side. And it took a side on behalf of the Northern Alliance, effectively, which was the anti-Taliban opposition. But that anti-Taliban opposition was comprised of, its leadership was comprised of serious war criminals, people that had been implicated in very serious crimes. As Sahar mentioned, there are no minorities represented in the new Taliban administration. The Hazaras in particular, a Shia community, very large Shia community in Afghanistan, have been targeted. And they will probably be targeted by this government. I mean, there hasn't been any accusation of widespread targeting of them at the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't, and they have a history of doing that, and it's very concerning. So I think when we look at how we got here, is that by intervening in the civil war, by picking a side, and by picking people who did not have credibility in the eyes of the general population, it undermined anything that the West tried to do. And I'm just giving you a brief anecdote, which I think kind of will bring this all home. In 2005, there was the first Afghanistan parliamentary elections since the 1970s. And for about a year, I was working on a few reports looking at the role of warlords and their political influence on the elections, but also a U.S. run and a U.S. funded, Japan funded UN-run operation to disarm warlord groups. Both were, the disarmament was a spectacular failure. And warlords refused to disarm. The elections were going on with warlords who refused to disarm. And you could see their influence throughout the results of the elections, and even on election day. And I remember I was with a very smart Afghan colleague of mine. I mean, probably one of the best political analysts I've ever met. And he and I got out of our car after a day of observing the elections, and I asked him, like, what do you think? And it was a pause, and I think we were both feeling the same thing. It was like, this was a disaster. This is the beginning of the end, because it was pretty clear that many of the people, these warlords or their proxies, were going to be elected to parliament, and therefore this effort to build, one of the main pillars of a democratically functioning society was already corrupt. And so at going that far back, 15 years, I think that the rot at the core of this experiment was already visible. And, the West just simply doubled down on the same old characters, the same guys who had terrible reputations that the Taliban exploited. I'm not saying that this is not to juxtapose the Taliban as, the saviors of Afghanistan at all. They've done terrible things too. But I think by intervening and picking a side that the general population did not really agree with, the Taliban were able to say, listen, we can provide justice. You may not like our justice. It's rough justice, but at least we'll be fair. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. So I think that's kind of that's in a nutshell where we are. It's very rough and dirty, but we made some the U.S. made some very poor choices about how it about the sides it took in Afghanistan, and not playing it straight down the middle and being fair.
Thank you. I hope we can learn a little bit of a lesson.
Yeah.
Who knows if we will. Timur, can you speak a little bit just about your experience with building this sort of telecommunications industry in Afghanistan, and where you see it going from here? I mean, we talked about, or you mentioned a little bit that there was data darkness when the Taliban first had control over Afghanistan, and that's not the case anymore. And I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of color about.
Sure. Absolutely. Happy to. So when you think about Afghanistan pre 9/11, and it's not just Afghanistan, but the experience I gleaned from there, and there's a lot of markets, a lot of countries in the world that gained telecommunications in the last 20 plus years, and it's been, for lack of a better term, pretty revolutionary in a lot of the countries of the world that previously didn't have access to media or telecoms and the like. So I'm a firm believer in the enabling capacity of having a vibrant media and telecommunications infrastructure in the country. So when I first went to work in 2005, as I mentioned, I was worked for about 8 months as a legal advisor for the Ministry of Information and Communications Technology, drafting the telecom law, which laid the framework, the regulatory framework that governs the existing telecom sector. At that point, there were 2 licensees. There was AWCC and Roshan, 2 telecom companies, and then eventually there was MTN, and then Etisalat. MTN's a South African country, but they have Pan-African and Middle Eastern presence. Etisalat's out of the UAE. And eventually Afghan Telecom was spun out to become Salih. So those are the existing players, and it was the largest tax-paying industry, and 80% market penetration. I mean, at that time, I think in 2005, when I started working, when I left the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, went to Roshan, I think there were about maybe 5 or 6 million subscribers, people with access to phones in the country. By the time I left, it was about 80% market penetration. So I mean, 80% of Afghans had access to a phone, or at least had some kind of antenna coverage. And access to other services like financial technology, and all the other services that would spin off of a vibrant telecom sector, mobile banking, etc. And so having that regulatory framework, and you saw just the benefit that people enjoy. People like having phones. I mean, let's face it, we like our mobile phones. We still do. Prior to 9/11, there was that access. I think in the statistic there was about 20,000 satellite phones in the country that were controlled by the Taliban in the late 90s, and then that changed considerably over the next 5 to 10 years. To this day, I've been speaking to my former colleagues who are at Roshan and who are in contact with the other mobile network operators, and what my understanding is people still want to use their phones. Taliban want to use their phones. They love social media. Apparently, they love Instagram and Facebook and the like. So I don't think, from that perspective, I don't expect that to change. How do you operate? Sahar mentioned issues of liquidity in the marketplace. I mean, banks are closed. I think they might be opening up a little bit. I think now that there's a interim central bank governor who's allowing for people to withdraw $200 a day from the bank. I mean, this could be changing on a daily basis. So there is some liquidity in the market, but there's really not that much cash. I think there was generally what you call a run on the banks in the weeks prior to the coming of the Taliban. But how do you operate these mega multinational organizations that have staff who have antenna towers around the country, that have generator sets that need to be refueled? You have to sell scratch cards, etc. I've been working on an initiative to try to distribute airtime to people, because most people have prepaid telephone sets where they pay as they go, like most of the emerging world. So people have been figuring that's one way to inject liquidity into the market, but you can't buy food with. Can you buy food with airtime? I mean, it's a little bit difficult, but I understand from talking to my former colleagues, friends of mine who work in the telecom sector and the media sector, they have every intention to keep going. I mean, they know they have responsibility. They're business people. They want to continue to run their businesses. What will the regs in Afghanistan? What will the Taliban say in terms of how they operate that? Again, they want to use their phones. People like having their phones. What I do understand also in the past, prior to the return of the Taliban, the telecom operators would have to shut down their towers in certain parts of the country at night, particularly in the southeast. Apparently, that's no longer the case. So in the last few weeks, they're able to run their networks. Their towers are humming 24/7 all over the country, which is an interesting development. Again, people want to use their phones, but whether that goes in terms of avoiding data darkness, I think the difference between now and then, in the 90s, the Taliban in the 90s, there weren't phones, they didn't have access. A lot of the Taliban now were born around the time of 9/11 or right before, right after, so they've grown up during this era of a wired Afghanistan, as have many of the Afghans who live there now. So there's probably that expectation, which I think is something that we should look upon positively. People want to make calls, people want to access information. And I think that that data darkness that existed before, and it was utterly, I mean, there was very little access to information in Afghanistan in the 90s. And I think now everyone has their mobile phones, they can act as journalists, they can report and the like. Whether that will continue, we have yet to see. Let's hope that they do. But yeah, it's an uncertainty, but I imagine it will continue, hopefully. But those companies are going to have challenges too. Those companies need more than $200 a day to operate. So we'll see how that continues.
Great.
Hope I
Thank
answered
you
your
so much.
question.
Yeah. I want to move on to what's happening with all of the people who have been evacuated and are waiting on status here. But before I do, Sahar, I noticed you were writing some notes. I don't know if you had something you wanted to add to anything.
I just wanted to say, I know I share Michael's assessment and the failures, but I also want to just say there are a lot of positive things also happened. Free media, independent media, Afghanistan has a very vibrant civil society. They're so active. Most of the population are, it's basically youth and young people. echoing what Timur was saying, very, very involved in social media to communicate, etc. Women and girls, advancement for women and girls in terms of access to education. It was really phenomenal, despite the flaws and the abandonment of the government of its own people, and the president just disappearing and forgetting his own people. There was amazing how many women were appointed in government positions, in senior positions, like the deputy minister for policy at the Ministry of Interior. Not just like only women going to the Ministry of Women's Affairs, but you just saw a lot of advancements for women in a very, very conservative culture and a country. So I think that that is a positive thing that came out of the intervention, I would say, and definitely in these three areas. So it's also just very hard to see, especially what's going to happen to women in Afghanistan and the sliding back on that. So something that the international community needs to be engaged and to put all its pressure to make sure that this new the new government is upholding its obligations under international law and all these treaties that the government has signed, including on women's rights.
Julie, if I could just pick up on what Sahar said, and I agree, I wholeheartedly agree with Sahar. I think, going back to your original question about how do I feel, I'm angry because there was no care taken to protect those things that Sahar just mentioned, right? It was a totally ill thought out, conceived and executed operation. I personally, as someone who's spent a lot of time in the country, I thought that violence begets violence, and the United States was not able to bring about the change that it kept saying it was going to do, from a military perspective. There clearly had to be a political solution, but there's no effort really put behind a very robust political effort. And I know that the negotiation teams tried very hard. I don't blame them. I think that comes from much higher above. But again, to Sahar's point, some really wonderful things happen, particularly in urban centers, and the work that Timur has done through his company. And then, and then the restaurants. I mean, that kind of cultural preservation and reactivation. The restaurant that Timur's family ran in Berkeley was a safe haven for refugees coming from the first war, after the Soviet invasion. And the restaurant that Timur started with his family in Kabul was similarly a safe haven, but for the young, politically active, progressive Kabulis that were trying to break out of a conservative society, and his restaurant provided a little bit of that refuge. And so and that's why I'm so angry and disheartened, not by the decision to leave, but by the decision not to have a plan in place to help protect some of this and preserve some of this. And I think now the responsibility is going to fall on, here in the United States, a lot on the Afghan diaspora communities and those local organizations that are supporting them. I think, there are many, there are, like Timur's family, there are many Afghan families that are in California that are going to be absorbing the responsibility to support and protect and nurture new arrivals and helping them settle into society, both here in the U.S. and other parts of the world. And I think we need to be really looking at some of those organizations and some of the things that they're going to need. And I think one of those things in particular, so many of them are going to be applying for asylum. That is very clear. And while there are a lot of lawyers in this country, there are not a lot of pro bono lawyers right now doing asylum cases. There are a lot of people coming across the southern border claiming asylum, and they're not just Afghans. And the Afghan debacle is going to be adding a lot of pressure and demand on this cohort of lawyers. And so I think looking at organizations that are providing pro bono legal services, particularly for asylum cases, and encouraging those and even encouraging them to say, hey, listen, we'll give you funds to help pay for some of these cases, right? And I think that type of legal aid is going to be really important around there.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I just want to add, you know, the withdrawal was done both for no thought of you know, how to maintain peace or a semblance of what had been in Afghanistan, but it also was done with no thought about how to get people out. And so what you have now is a situation where the US refugee resettlement program is completely unable to process people as quickly as it needs to. And that's something that Sahar mentioned earlier, you know, the US refugee resettlement infrastructure was created to respond to these kinds of emergencies. But over time, what has happened is it's become a very slow, bureaucratic process that takes 2+ years of vetting, et cetera, to welcome a refugee onto US soil. And in the meantime, they have to live for 2 years with incredible uncertainty and lack of safety. And that's the program now. And then what happened under the Trump administration is that program was completely decimated. And so the State Department can't actually process people because it doesn't have the staffing to do so. And the US agencies that resettle refugees here in the US don't have any staff either. So we now have people who have arrived on US soil, even though they haven't gone through a refugee resettlement process. They're not even designated as refugees. They're given, you mentioned P2 status, humanitarian parole. It's a temporary status designed to basically quickly evacuate people, but give them they have no legal right or to stay in the US, which also means because they're not designated as refugees, there's no support from the government allocated to help those people. They arrive with a backpack and no support. They arrive without legal status and also without the possibility for family reunification and other things that come with the refugee resettlement program. And so it's a mess. People are mostly on air bases. They're trickling, as you know, some are trickling into the country, but there's a really big question about how all of these people are going to get processed and whether or not Congress will act to change their status to refugees so that they can get access to services, to resettlement, to legal status, and ultimately to family reunification. But we don't know if that will happen. We don't know if Congress will be able to act. And we also don't know if President Biden will take the initiative to do it if Congress doesn't act. So we're in a really liminal space, I guess, of unknown and uncertainty about what's going to happen with all of these people. And you mentioned the amazing Afghan civil society here in the US, and I'm just sorry, I'm talking now. I'm going to put it back out to you. You know, I'd love to hear more just about how people, like, what can we do to help and be supportive? And you know, Refugee Action Fund, we fund grassroots community-based organizations. That's what we do because we believe that people who are most impacted or most close to the community are best positioned to provide support. And I'd love to just hear a little bit more from you about what you're seeing on the ground in terms of how help is happening and how we can be supportive of those efforts. Anyone? Did I say it all?
Well, I could speak to that. I'm sure Sahar and Michael have a lot of info to add there. But what I've noticed in the last month, and again, I just have a second thank you again for setting this up. And Michael was talking about his emotions, and Sahar as well, and the gamut of emotions that I've experienced and that we've all experienced over the last month. It's just absolutely bewildering, from anger, which Michael mentioned, to absolute heartbreak, which Sahar mentioned, in terms of just the loss of generations of work, people who bought into this vision of Afghanistan, not just the Afghans, but people supporting. So it has been very difficult. It continues to be. So the idea of data darkness or the country being neglected, I think one of the issues that happened in the 90s was it was largely neglected by the world. So I think we have that responsibility in our own way. Obviously, it's, you know, everyone can, the largest of everyone is up to their own person. But I think we do have a collective responsibility just to not let it be neglected, because it's so easily happened. When one of my friends who's Mexican American said, the cartels aren't covered really in the media because they don't want to be covered, right? So obviously it's very newsworthy, that kind of news. So this is very newsworthy as well. So I think it's important that we continue to pay attention and devote our efforts. So what I've seen a lot in terms of my own sphere, a lot of highly localized efforts, people to mobilize. My wife formerly was with DFID, and she's been plugging into her networks in the UK and DC and other parts of the organizations and the NGO world to try to mobilize to get people out. I know a lot of Afghan Americans here who I've been in contact with, part of social media and various outlets, and also email groups and trying to mobilize to help people. I think the point that Michael made about pro bono work and helping, really, the heavy lifting is going to be the documentation. And this is something I'm sure Sahar can speak to with volumes. And so I want to let her speak to that. But that's something as a lawyer that I'm starting to mobilize to do as well, and part of groups and discussion groups. But I think that's one piece. And then is maintaining the focus on the country. But again, it will. So at current time, it seems pretty highly localized, although there seems to be more of an apparatus forming. I'll leave it to my other panelists to speak to that as well.
No, just very briefly, I always look at America and saying there are sometimes good policies and sometimes terrible policies in foreign policy arena, for sure. And but I also look across the country and the generosity of Americans, right? When crises happen, to help fellow humanity. And I think just the outpouring of anger and sorrow and empathy that has come across the country from all walks of life, every political perspective, except for a few, I think majority has been really, that really is terrific. And I think, Julie, I think the challenge is that the money from Congress and how they're going to be allocating it to help in the resettlement process. And I know there's a lot of advocacy happening in DC to make them humanitarian parolees so they can access these funds, I think is really important. And there's a lot of advocacy that's going on to get that to happen. But again, that people and through the Refugee Action Fund can identify groups that you're going to be channeling funds to for disbursement to help in the resettlement process I think is key. And again, I get asked all the time, like, where should I donate money to, etc. And it's important that, money is, now even Uber is, taking in donations. I think it's great. It's very instinctive that we just click $50 or $5 or whatever. But I think the fact that even Uber is having this, I think it's just pretty amazing, So I think, but really having the list of organizations through the Refugee Action Fund that that donors want to make sure that their their funding is going to the right cause and it's being used with the right organization, I think would, and I think that this is a service that, that Refugee Action Fund does such a good job of honing in, identifying those groups and giving donors the belief that their money is going to be used in a proper way, I think is something that you are able to do.
Thank you, Sahar. We have one question in the chat, and we have maybe a minute or two for it. It's from Lutz. It says there's been a lot of talk in the media about Taliban 2.0 versus 1.0. What is the sense of the speakers on how we should think about that?
2.0 and 1.0, there's no difference. It's matters of degrees here. And I think, as Sahar mentioned very clearly, there's no diversity. There's no ethnic diversity, gender diversity. They dissolved the women's ministry. The Vice and Virtue Police are back, but in a different name. That nasty ministry that policed your personal and social behavior. It's an emir. It's an emirate. They've said they're going to be very much like they were in the 1990s. That's coming out of their own mouth. So I don't think we can expect very much moderation. I think, you know, it'd be wishful thinking to expect them to be any different. And everything that we're seeing right now, you know, it just keep like over the past couple of weeks, you just keep seeing an escalation of more violence against different groups, and particularly women. You know, there are stories of, you know, The Guardian had a really a very good story the other day about women going back to Kabul University, but they're segregated. And, you know, there is a gender apartheid that's being put in place. And if there are no teachers there, are women really then being taught?
Yeah.
You know, so I think, you know, we have to take, you know, the Taliban 2.0's kind of moderation with a very, very, very large or small grain of salt. I don't never know how that works, but anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, just to quickly add on that, but I agree with Michael. But the issue really is that if you don't engage with this government, then you ignore Afghanistan. And as odious and terrible that this government is, the international community has to use its leverage in terms of because 98% of the country's aid it comes from foreign aid, right? If the income. So unless the Taliban is going to rely on narcotics trade to run the country, it's in which they don't. So I think there is areas of leverage that can be used to move forward. And Afghanistan in 1990 is very different from Afghanistan right now. I think, women are protesting across the country, and saying, our rights matter. And so I think there is, yes, I agree, it hasn't changed, Taliban hasn't changed, but the world has changed. And I think we have to make sure that we can use our leverage to ensure that rights are respected or move forward in that direction. And even engage with a very odious entity,
On this point, I'm less sanguine than Sahar, I think. I think, Myanmar is a great kind of analog to how the world, and particularly the West, has dealt with an odious government that, there's only two choices. It's like engagement or disengage, right? And engagement means you need to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses. And we saw how that played out in Afghanistan, or I'm sorry, in Myanmar recently. And then the subsequent Rohingya genocide, and then the coup. And, I'm not, very different situations, but I think the broad points of the analogy are correct, that you need to have, the West is not very nimble when it comes to, and the West and the United Nations are not very nimble when it comes to dealing with odious human rights abusing governments. They don't really have good strategies to engage, and they don't have good strategies to talk to the government while trying to protect people, and forcing a political solution to things that can set the country on a more, I think, a more stable human rights, respecting trajectory. It's not something that the international community at this point is very, very good at. So I don't expect anything in the next several years to really pan out. I think, on the point that Sahar made, and there is this an obituary written for Afghanistan. And I don't think we need to be writing an obituary for the country. There are 35 million people, 40 million people in the country that do want to have an end to violence, that do want to be able to make their own choices and to live a peaceful existence and protect their culture and practice their culture. And, so I think the challenge is going to be and how to really get down and protect some of these local organizations that are doing that tough work when the country is when the government's trying to cut itself off from the rest of the world. So, but again, there's a lot of energy, particularly in the cities that have been, a generation of people that never knew the Taliban, right? And didn't really feel the war in many senses, and have been exposed to social media. So I think there's going to be an energy there that we haven't seen before.
Great. Thank you so much. I would love to continue this conversation for another hour, but I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I want to thank you so much. This has been an incredibly informative and engaging conversation. So thank you so much for your time. I just want to sort of take us full circle to where we began, which is Greg sharing the reason that Refugee Action Fund got started, which was back in 2015 when there was a flood of refugees coming out of Syria, and he came together with some friends and said, we have to do something. We can't turn a blind eye, you know, and we're at a moment in time where the number of displaced people has never been greater in the world. There's 80 million people. The numbers just keep rising, how many people are displaced. And, you know, the Afghan refugee crisis is one of so many. I mean, just with the Afghan crisis, we've talked about the need for lawyers who can convert temporary status into permanent status, the need for advocacy to keep the pressure on the US government to continue to help Afghans out, get out and find pathways to resettlement, the need to rebuild our refugee resettlement infrastructure, and then the need for continued support to organizations. And there's been a few mentioned in the chat here, PANA, Women for Afghan Women. There are many incredible organizations across this country working to provide support with dignity to people who have been through an incredible amount of trauma and are going to need to rebuild their lives. And today, you know, less than 1% of US philanthropy goes to support refugees and migrants. Actually, that's the less than 1% goes to support immigration. So within that, you know, refugees and asylum seekers and those seeking safety for no fault of their own because they had no choice but to flee, there's just not enough infrastructure. And that is what Refugee Action Fund is about. It's about continuing to bring funds to this work long after media attention turns away from it, and to keep all of you engaged as long as we can on this issue, because we know it's not going away, even though in maybe a month or two from now, it's not going to be on the front of your mind. So we have been providing funding to organizations and sustainable support. I think there were a couple questions in the chat about what we're doing specifically with Afghan communities, and we are looking for organizations that we're going to be funding. You know, for us, we believe very strongly in providing general support, long-term funding to help organizations really build and grow over time, not just like, oh, this is a crisis right now, we're going to fund that group, and then next year we're going to turn to the most imminent issue in the media. So it's a process for us, and you know, on our website, I'm sure we'll be providing updates about the organizations that we're supporting. But in the meantime, you know, we welcome your support, and you can make a donation at refugeeactionfund.org. And I'm also going to circulate an amazing organization in New York called Women for Afghan Women has circulated. It's like a Google Doc, and they're just putting all of the ways that people can help. If you're in Afghanistan and you need help, how to get services. If you're in Maryland and want to help an Afghan family, where you can go. And so for those of you who have the time and energy and resources to help people who are arriving, there's a lot of ways that you can engage with your local community. And I'll send around a Google Doc that will be continually updated, that will share out those opportunities. Even just, for example, if you happen to have a spare place to stash somebody for 3 to 6 months, I mean, housing is an incredible need right now, and Airbnb is giving people the opportunity to register with them and then and provide housing. So there's just a lot of ways that we can be galvanized to provide support. Now, I'll encourage all of you to think about the ways in which you can do that. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your time, and I hope you all have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Take care, everyone.
Bye.